Tonight we trudge through the shadowy, soap-scented corridors of medieval Europe, where the clatter of wooden tubs mingles with the scent of damp linen and faint whiffs of herbs tucked between folds. You probably won't survive this without questioning your own sock-sorting habits, or the fact that you may never look at your washing machine the same way again. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Now, dim the lights, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You step carefully over uneven flagstones, your fingers brushing against the stiff hems of sheets hung on rough ropes, each one bearing marks that could tell a story if you only knew the secret language. These weren't doodles or idle scribbles. They were deliberate, meaningful signs, tiny codes sewn, drawn, or scorched into fabric, symbols of ownership, identity, and sometimes rebellion. You might imagine the average laundry day as tedious and monotonous, and yet here, in the careful positioning of a triangle in the corner of a napkin or a curlicue in the hem of a tunic, lies an entire culture whispering across centuries. Historians still argue whether some marks were invented purely to avoid losing linens or if they also served as playful commentary. You picture a laundress snickering as she applies a small cat motif to the Lord's favorite tablecloth, a silent critique that only her circle could read. In fact, the variety is staggering. Simple crosses, initials, geometric shapes, animals, even tiny ladders or keys. You notice that some marks are so delicate they could disappear in a single wash, while others are boldly stamped or embroidered, proclaiming loudly, "This belongs to the Merchants Guild, and anyone who dares claim it otherwise will regret it." Medieval washhouses were chaotic places, crowded with women, men, children, and sometimes animals wandering too close to tubs of steaming water. The sensory overload is almost cinematic. The hiss of boiling water, the scratch of brushes on coarse fabric, the occasional clang of a dropped pan, and a faint odor that combines soap, smoke, and, well, human life. You imagine stepping in, laden with your own bundles, trying to decode who marked what and why. Each symbol has a story, each fold a purpose. The humblest linen carries a little piece of a household's pride, a family's habit, or a guild's secret. Then there's the playful side of the marks. One tiny mark, a crescent moon stitched onto the edge of a towel, might have been intended as a subtle jest, a visual wink at neighbors or servants. Others may have been outright practical, meant to keep the laundry from disappearing into someone else's basket, though you can't help but suspect the laundresses sometimes enjoyed a little harmless mischief. Imagine learning that a symbol you've worn unknowingly all week is a critique of your posture or your choice in hats. Medieval humans had a wicked sense of humor, one that survives faintly in these faint scratches and embroidered loops. Even the simplest marks can reveal layers of history. A single line, a squiggle, or a set of dots can indicate a family's initials, a guild affiliation, or a geographic region. You hold a sheet and imagine the person who made that mark, imagining their hands coated in soap and flour, their hair pulled back, their day measured in water temperature and the rhythm of scrubbing. Scholars debate whether these marks were standardized at all or if they evolved organically, as playful variations proliferated across towns, villages, and cities. One small mark might be identical to another from miles away, or entirely unique. And it's not just about ownership. Some marks conveyed status or prestige, though that will come in the next sections. Tonight, you focus on the intimacy. You imagine slipping a sheet over your arm, feeling the texture and imagining the secret conversations embedded in thread and pigment. A laundress of humble origin may have had the audacity to adorn her master's napkin with a tiny sun motif, a bold assertion of her own presence in an otherwise invisible life. Perhaps she laughed quietly as she worked, imagining the day someone would notice. You probably won't survive this mental leap without acknowledging the thrill of such small acts of rebellion and creativity. And then there's the smell again, herbs tucked in corners, faint traces of vinegar, a lingering smoke from a nearby hearth. These were as much part of the code as any stitch, because scent and memory were intertwined. You breathe deeply, feeling the connection across centuries, imagining that a single puff of lavender might signal clean and ready, while a hint of rosemary could mean belonging to the Healer's Guild. Fringe scholars speculate that some symbols doubled as talismans, protecting garments, or even people, from bad luck or illness, though historians still argue whether that's superstition or intentional messaging. Either way, the laundry becomes more than utility. It becomes a language, and you, in this quiet night, are learning to read it. You pause, letting your fingers trace the faded marks along a hem. Tiny scratches in the linen tell a story of time, care, and ingenuity. The sun outside may be long set, but here in the dim glow of your imagination, the past hums alive. Medieval laundry was never merely functional. It was social, artistic, practical, and occasionally mischievous. You probably won't survive thinking about all the coded triangles, cats, moons, and crosses without wanting to examine your own linens tomorrow. And yet, that curiosity is exactly the point. The silent thrill of connection to lives so long gone yet still whispering in symbols etched in fabric. The secret language of medieval laundry marks is waiting for you, stitched into the mundane, hiding in plain sight. You take another breath, feeling the weight of history in a sheet so ordinary, so simple, yet so alive with stories. Remember, this is just the beginning. The language stretches outward, and tonight, you are the eager reader. You follow the faint trail of symbols stitched into linens, realizing that each mark is a signature of its owner, a medieval social fingerprint, if you will. Marks of ownership weren't just practical reminders. They were declarations of identity, tiny claims that whispered, "This is mine." As you trudge through the crowded washhouse in your mind, you notice the meticulous care with which these marks were applied. Some are elegant monograms in looping script, others are rudimentary scratches, and a few are whimsical sketches of cats, birds, or even stick figure humans. You probably won't survive this without questioning why anyone would ever settle for plain initials when a little fox in the corner conveys so much more personality. Ownership marks served many practical purposes. Households often had dozens, sometimes hundreds, of linens. Sheets, towels, tablecloths, and undergarments, all subject to mix-ups when washed communally or sent out for laundering. You can almost hear the medieval equivalent of someone groaning, "Not again, my good sheet's gone into the baker's basket." A well-placed symbol could prevent that confusion, allowing you to reclaim your property with minimal argument. Historians still argue whether some symbols evolved organically within households or if there was an unofficial grammar that everyone recognized. Perhaps one family's simple triangle indicated kitchen use, while another signified best linens only. But the marks weren't always purely functional. You notice a tiny hand-drawn sun in the corner of a pillowcase, winking at anyone who might peer too closely. Fringe sources suggest some marks were created almost like little jokes or personal expressions, medieval graffiti stitched into fabric. Perhaps the laundress had a bad day or simply a mischievous streak. Either way, she made sure her handiwork carried personality beyond the practical. You can almost imagine a servant's giggle as she places a mischievous rabbit on the hem of her master's towel, a silent rebellion folded into the routine of washing. The placement of marks is another layer of communication. You notice that symbols are often tucked into corners, stitched along seams, or painted near edges that were least likely to be trimmed. This placement could indicate hierarchy. The more prominent or visible the mark, the higher the status or importance of the owner. Conversely, marks tucked away might belong to servants or less prestigious family members. You probably won't survive this without mentally cataloging every fold and stitch as a potential clue in this secret social code. Scholars still argue whether subtle placement differences conveyed nuanced messages about class, gender, or occupation, and it seems the debate is far from settled. Children were also participants in this silent language. You picture a young boy carefully tracing his initials onto a handkerchief under the watchful eye of his mother. In some cases, learning the marks was part of growing up, a lesson in household management and personal responsibility. The child's first mark might be crude, but over time, he or she mastered the symbol's shapes, placement, and style. You probably won't survive realizing that this early training was essentially the medieval equivalent of learning calligraphy and social networking at once. In rare cases, mischievous children added extra symbols to cause confusion or laughter, a tactic that might inspire small familial quarrels, or at least an exasperated groan from adults. The symbols themselves are endlessly fascinating. Animals were popular, often reflecting characteristics associated with the household or the individual, a fox for cunning, a lion for bravery, or a bird for a free spirit. Geometric shapes, triangles, squares, circles, were simpler but carried their own meanings, sometimes tied to guilds, trade, or profession. You probably won't survive noticing how often repeated symbols cropped up across different towns, hinting at shared knowledge or regional codes. French historians even suggest that some marks were deliberately cryptic, designed to confuse outsiders or protect valuable linens from theft or resale. Speaking of theft, these ownership marks were not just polite reminders, they were insurance. Linen was expensive, and losing even one sheet could hurt a family's finances. You can picture a well-to-do merchant's prized tablecloth with an intricate stitched emblem, practically daring anyone to claim it as theirs. Some marks even included personal or household symbols that outsiders wouldn't understand, creating a layer of security beyond mere letters or numbers. Historians still argue whether medieval households emphasized security over aesthetics, or if the two were inseparable in practice. Either way, the dual purpose, practical and personal, makes every symbol a tiny story waiting to be read. Marks could also reflect social networks. You notice recurring symbols across neighboring households, suggesting connections, shared services, or friendly rivalries. In some cases, a mark might signal a favored laundress, someone trusted to wash multiple families' linens without complaint. In others, marks might contain subtle jabs or playful critiques of a neighbor's habits, like leaving tiny evidence of their carelessness in a corner of a tablecloth. You probably won't survive without appreciating the sly humor embedded in these tiny signals, or the quiet ways medieval humans communicated without uttering a word. Even the choice of material for marking is revealing. Some families used ink, some stitched thread, others scorched a small pattern with hot irons. You can almost see a laundress dipping her quill into ink, holding her breath as she traces the mark, knowing that once it dries, it speaks for her household. French scholars suggest that some inks were treated with secret recipes, milk, vinegar, herbs, to resist fading, making them functional yet still artistic. Historians still argue whether certain techniques were widespread or unique to particular regions, but the variation is remarkable. Finally, you realize these marks weren't static, they evolved over time. As families grew, merged, or moved, the symbols adapted. A triangle might gain extra flourishes, a cross might acquire a dot in a corner, or a tiny rabbit might become a family emblem. You probably won't survive without admiring the subtle creativity embedded in mundane tasks. Each mark is a living record of ownership, pride, humor, and social dynamics, and they whisper quietly, waiting for someone curious enough, like you, to notice them. You slip deeper into the maze of marks and realize that some of them carry a double life. On the surface, they declare ownership, but beneath that, they often speak in the secret dialect of medieval guilds. Guilds were powerful networks of artisans, merchants, and tradespeople who maintained strict codes, both social and professional. You probably won't survive this without marveling at how a small stitch or doodle could serve as a badge of membership or a veiled message to fellow insiders. Each guild had its own traditions, and laundry marks became a surprisingly sophisticated method of communication in a world where letters were slow, and trust was earned cautiously. You notice that in some cities, guild laundresses were practically celebrities. A master weaver's household might employ one who could instantly recognize and mark textiles according to the guild's exacting rules. These marks could indicate quality, origin, or even alert others to a rival's underhanded tactics. Fringe historians suggest that some symbols functioned as warnings, subtle "don't mess with this" messages to anyone who understood the code. You can imagine a fellow guild member spotting a particular flourish on a hem and nodding knowingly, while outsiders remain oblivious. Historians still argue whether these guild codes were standardized across regions or if each town developed its own local dialect of marks. Sometimes the marks served to signal reputation. You trudge along the imaginary streets of a medieval town, picturing merchants gossiping over ale about a laundress famed for her meticulous embroidery or another notorious for letting linen shrink or fade. A single mark could elevate or tarnish a household's standing. In this way, laundry became a silent yet potent medium for social commentary within the guild network. You probably won't survive realizing that the stakes were surprisingly high. Misread a symbol, and you could lose status, or worse, offend someone who held real influence in your town. Then there's the competitive side. Guilds weren't just collaborative, they were fiercely competitive. Laundresses and other household workers might develop small innovations in marking techniques to outshine rivals. A particular twist of thread, a tiny, or a unique animal design could differentiate a guild's work from others, functioning as both advertisement and signature. Fringe accounts suggest that some guilds deliberately encouraged playful rivalry, using marks to challenge others in a silent, sophisticated game. You probably won't survive without smiling at the image of medieval workers waging creative battles on the hems of aprons and tablecloths. Some marks even carried encoded messages beyond mere ownership or guild affiliation. They could indicate schedules, obligations, or instructions. For instance, a mark might denote that the linen needed special washing, was meant for a particular festival, or was reserved for a specific family member. You imagine a laundress flipping through stacks of fabrics, quickly recognizing these symbols like a secret calendar or instruction manual written in threads and scratches. Historians still argue whether this system was formally taught or passed down informally from one worker to another, evolving organically within households and guilds. Symbols often conveyed allegiance as well. You picture a network of artisans whose marks subtly proclaim loyalty to a particular master or guild branch. One embroidered fox in a hem might indicate that the laundry belongs to a weaver from a specific district, while a small spiral could signify that it has passed through a trusted laundress's hands. Fringe researchers suggest that some of these marks also acted as social glue, reinforcing trust in a largely unregulated marketplace. You probably won't survive noticing how much political, economic, and social weight was resting on what seems like simple decoration. Interestingly, the guild influence extended to playful espionage. Laundresses and workers could send subtle signals about shortages, rivalries, or opportunities for alliances. You imagine a tablecloth subtly marked to indicate that a particular merchant's textiles were especially fine or that someone in town was planning a market maneuver. Historians still argue whether such covert communications were widespread or the exception, but evidence suggests it was certainly a possibility in cities where guilds wielded considerable power. The marks also bridged generations. Young apprentices learned to recognize the codes and replicate them, ensuring continuity within guild systems. You probably won't survive realizing that every mark was a lesson, a tiny tutorial in literacy, numeracy, and social etiquette, encoded in the folds of everyday life. A child learning to identify a triangle as belonging to the cloth merchant or a small animal as trusted laundress was essentially decoding the town's social map one napkin at a time. You notice the aesthetic side as well. Guilds prized not only functionality but also beauty. Marks were sometimes ornate, incorporating flourishes, patterns, or miniature images. You imagine a guild competition where two laundresses mark identical linens, and the one with the most elegant or inventive symbol wins praise, possibly influencing commissions and wages. French historians suggest that such competitions may have shaped the evolution of mark styles, creating an informal artistic language embedded in utility. There's also a rhythm to it. You picture the steady beat of hands scrubbing, dipping, and marking, each movement reinforcing the social order while creating a private, almost meditative performance. Guild codes were not static. They shifted, evolved, and adapted with trends, personal flair, and social shifts. You probably won't survive without admiring how innovation and tradition existed side by side in these tiny, quiet symbols. Even when guilds were absent, their influence lingered. Merchants who worked outside formal guilds often borrowed or imitated guild marks, consciously or unconsciously adhering to an unspoken visual vocabulary. You can almost hear a laundress muttering to herself as she borrows a spiral from a rival guild, tweaking it slightly to maintain originality while signaling competence. Historians still argue whether such borrowing undermined guild authority or reinforced a broader, informal network of professional norms. Finally, you notice the subtle human drama embedded in these codes: rivalries, flattery, rebellion, humor, and pride, all stitched into linens that were used, washed, and reused. Each mark carries a story, a secret conversation frozen in fabric. You probably won't survive this without wanting to pull out your own towels and start marking them with tiny cryptic symbols, imagining that someone, somewhere, might someday decode your whims and humor. In guilds or households, marks weren't just functional. They were living, breathing artifacts of social life, miniature windows into a complex, largely invisible world. You follow the trail of marks and notice a pattern. Some are more elaborate than others, almost theatrical in their presentation. These are the symbols of status. In medieval society, the placement, shape, and complexity of a laundry mark could quietly broadcast wealth, power, and social rank. You probably won't survive this without imagining a noblewoman's embroidered sheets shimmering in candlelight, a triangle in the corner signaling that these linens belong to a household of high standing, while a simple cross on a rough-spun towel denotes the servant quarters. Symbols spoke volumes without a word ever being uttered. High-ranking households often had a system for ensuring their marks were both visible and secure. A wealthy merchant's bed linens might feature elaborate initials entwined with tiny animals, suns, or abstract motifs. Fringe sources suggest that some families even employed professional stitchers whose sole job was to mark textiles according to household custom. You picture a young apprentice, hands trembling over silk, replicating the signature pattern with precision because a single misstep could be socially embarrassing. Historians still argue whether these elaborate marks were universally understood outside elite circles or deliberately inscrutable to assert exclusivity. It wasn't just about aesthetics, though. Marks of status also conveyed authority within the household. Servants would instantly recognize which linens were sacred, which could be laundered without fuss, and which were reserved for special occasions. You probably won't survive realizing that a small decorative flourish in the corner of a sheet might dictate your daily chores. Some symbols even instructed who could handle the items or when they could be used, turning mundane laundry into a quiet system of governance. Animals and geometric shapes frequently carried coded meanings. Lions, eagles, or even rabbits could symbolize courage, vigilance, or cleverness. Triangles, squares, and circles might denote wealth, lineage, or connections to particular trades or guilds. You imagine a linen chest opening to reveal a tapestry of tiny, deliberate codes, each telling a story about the household's aspirations and social ambitions. French historians speculate that some families used secret combinations to mark the finest items, readable only to those trained in their visual language. Even placement mattered. A mark on the hem or edge might indicate a lower-ranked user, while one sewn prominently on the corner of a tablecloth or sheet broadcast prestige. You probably won't survive noticing the subtle hierarchy in thread. Something as small as positioning could convey family rank, gender of the intended user, or intended purpose of the fabric. Historians still argue whether medieval households had formalized placement rules, or if these were passed down organically through practice and imitation. There was also a playful aspect to status marks. A clever laundress might add a tiny decorative flourish that only insiders would notice, signaling wit or skill. You can imagine a neighbor visiting and glimpsing the mark, thinking it a simple initial, only to miss the hidden motif that carries centuries of family pride. Fringe evidence hints that some families enjoyed inventing elaborate personal emblems, almost like coats of arms, to elevate their social image subtly, without verbal boasting. Status marks extended beyond the household, too. When linens traveled, gifted, laundered, or sent to markets, the symbols communicated social position to outsiders. You probably won't survive imagining a merchant inspecting a shipment of marked textiles, instantly gauging the wealth and connections of the sender without a single word. Historians still argue whether such marks were primarily functional or whether their primary purpose was social signaling. In practice, it was probably both. Children were subtly trained to recognize these distinctions. From a young age, they learned which linens were their parents' and which were for daily chores, developing a visual literacy in symbols and positioning. You picture a child carefully observing a complex motif on a pillowcase, tracing the lines with their fingers, internalizing a hierarchy that was both practical and educational. Fringe sources suggest that in some households, children might even add small marks under supervision, learning the language of status through direct practice. Even mundane items carried messages of prestige. A hand towel in a wealthy household could be marked with more care than a servant's entire sheet. The choice of thread, ink, or pigment also indicated quality. You probably won't survive noticing that a single, carefully placed stitch could communicate more about social standing than a gilded brooch, because it was both functional and visible to those who understood the code. Historians still argue whether the visual language of status marks extended to all strata or was mostly an elite practice, though evidence points to a surprising mix of both. Religion intersected with status as well. Crosses or other holy symbols could appear alongside a family emblem, signaling piety and wealth simultaneously. You can almost see a family displaying their linens at festivals, subtle motifs sending messages of devotion, prosperity, and refinement to onlookers. Fringe scholars speculate that some markings combined spiritual protection with social signaling, a dual-purpose strategy that underscores the sophistication of this visual language. Finally, the humor of status marks should not be underestimated. A laundress might sneak a tiny animal in the corner of a noble's sheet, a joke for those who knew the household dynamics, or a playful signature. You probably won't survive imagining the private amusement, a tiny rebellion woven into silk or linen, visible only to those who knew how to read it. In essence, every status mark was a microcosm of medieval life: hierarchy, pride, play, and practical necessity all stitched together in thread and ink, whispering silently through time. You start noticing a different rhythm in the marks now, one that isn't about pride or secret guild codes but about survival, practical protection. Medieval laundry was constantly at risk. Communal washhouses, traveling merchants, and bustling marketplaces meant that linens could easily get lost, stolen, or mixed up. You probably won't survive realizing that a single tiny mark, barely visible on the edge of a sheet, could prevent a small household disaster. A triangle, a swirl, or a carefully etched initial could serve as a guardian of property, a silent safeguard against chaos in a world where linen was more valuable than gold in some regions. Marks served as early insurance. Households invested considerable effort and resources into acquiring and maintaining their textiles. One mislaid tablecloth or undergarment could create awkward confrontations, financial loss, or social embarrassment. You imagine a laundress dipping her brush in ink, hesitating for a moment before stamping a unique symbol onto the fabric, thinking, "If anyone takes this, they'll know exactly whose it is." Historians still argue whether some marks were primarily functional or if they carried an equally important social message, but it's clear that practicality dominated many decisions. The marks could also prevent mistakes during washing and storage. Communal washhouses were notorious for mix-ups. Linens from multiple households were scrubbed in the same tubs, hung on shared lines, and sometimes folded into the wrong bundles. You probably won't survive picturing the chaos. A merchant's prized sheets accidentally swapped with a neighbor's coarse rags, all because no one recognized the subtle marks. Fringe sources suggest that some households even color-coded symbols or incorporated small pictographs, making misidentification almost impossible. Beyond mix-ups, the marks served as warnings of care instructions. You notice tiny dots or lines that might indicate special treatment: wash separately, do not boil, or handle with care. You can almost hear a laundress muttering, "This one's delicate, don't ruin it like last week." Historians still argue whether these instructions were standardized or unique to each household, but the evidence shows a sophisticated system of visual cues embedded in otherwise mundane fabric. Some marks even protected against theft. Linen was a highly valuable commodity, sometimes more so than clothing because of its versatility, durability, and expense. You probably won't survive imagining a row of neatly marked sheets drying in the sun, each symbol daring any would-be thief to take a closer look. Fringe historians suggest that some families developed especially cryptic marks designed to confuse outsiders while signaling ownership clearly to insiders, a medieval form of cryptography. The method of marking often reinforced protection. Ink, thread, or scorched symbols were applied in ways that were difficult to remove without damaging the textile. You notice that marks could be hidden in folds, stitched along seams, or placed in corners that might be trimmed or folded during normal use. This ensured that even if linens changed hands, the symbol remained. Historians still argue whether households deliberately developed these techniques to safeguard property or whether the placement evolved from habit and practicality. Laundry marks could also function as identification for traveling textiles. You trudge along the bustling medieval markets in your mind, imagining merchants sending linens to fays or distant towns. A small embroidered mark acted like a passport, letting recipients and traders identify the rightful owner without lengthy explanations. You probably won't survive noticing how much logistical genius is embedded in what seems like a simple triangle or cross. It's a medieval system of inventory management disguised as decoration. In some cases, marks provided warnings of contents or origin. Fringe records suggest that certain symbols might indicate the type of cloth, the fabric's origin, or even the presence of special dyes. For instance, a faint sun motif might denote linen meant for festival use, while a small bird could indicate textiles produced by a particular guild. Historians still argue whether these markings were primarily functional or if they also conveyed prestige, but often, they did both. Household rituals also reinforced protection. You notice laundresses teaching children to recognize the marks, repeating instructions about how to handle marked linens. A simple stitch might serve as both a visual cue and a mnemonic device. Handle this gently, it belongs to the master, or this one goes to the market stand today. You probably won't survive realizing how embedded these systems were in everyday life, teaching responsibility, memory, and observation through what we now consider mundane chores. The marks could even evolve to anticipate problems. If a family frequently sent linens to distant relatives or to fairs, marks might adapt, becoming more elaborate to prevent confusion or theft. You can imagine a laundry chest where each fold reveals a carefully coded trail, a system refined over months or years. Fringe accounts hint that some households innovated their own protective languages, blending symbols of ownership with instructions for care, transport, and security. Finally, practical protection didn't exclude humor or creativity. A laundress might add a whimsical flourish, a tiny smiley face, a stitched paw print, a curl in a corner, not only signaling ownership but also delighting in a private joke. You probably won't survive imagining the quiet joy and mischief embedded in these otherwise utilitarian marks. In a world where linens were precious and washing a labor-intensive task, the marks were both shields and signatures, safeguarding property while adding a personal touch. You lean closer, intrigued by the physicality of these marks, and notice that the materials and methods used to make them are as varied as the symbols themselves. Medieval laundresses didn't have pens, pencils, or modern dyes. You probably won't survive realizing that some marks were scratched with charcoal, dabbed with natural inks, or stitched painstakingly with thread spun from flax or wool. Each choice of medium carried meaning. Some were intended to survive years of washing, while others were deliberately temporary, fading after a few cycles as if to remind everyone that some secrets are meant to vanish. Ink was surprisingly common. You can almost see a laundress mixing iron gall or walnut ink in a tiny pot, dipping a quill or fine brush to trace initials or symbols onto a sheet or pillowcase. Fringe scholars speculate that certain recipes for ink included subtle additives like vinegar, milk, or plant extracts to help them resist washing or fading. Historians still argue whether these secret recipes were regional, family-based, or widely circulated among laundresses, but the ingenuity is unmistakable. A symbol drawn in this way was both practical and expressive, a tiny badge of care and craft. Stitching was another method, and one that required significant skill. You notice patterns that aren't just functional but decorative, blending lines, curls, and dots into recognizable emblems. You probably won't survive without imagining hours spent hunched over coarse fabric, a needle and thread moving methodically, perhaps with a hint of playfulness. Some households had professional embroiderers or trained children who maintained consistency in these marks, ensuring that the family's symbols were recognizable even to outsiders. Fringe accounts suggest that slight variations in stitching could even denote different branches of the same family or indicate particular laundress's handiwork. Then there were temporary methods, charcoal rubbing, water-soluble paints, or chalk marks applied before washing and fading afterward. You probably won't survive picturing a laundress laughing quietly as she marks a stack of sheets, knowing the symbols will disappear in the next wash. This ephemerality added a layer of mystery. Some marks were permanent claims, others playful messages, visible only for a fleeting moment. Historians still argue whether these transient marks served practical purposes or were mostly whimsical, but evidence suggests a mix of both. Water played a critical role, too. You imagine dipping fabrics into tubs of steaming water, the heat causing some pigments to darken or thread to tighten. Some marks were even activated by washing. A diluted ink or plant dye would reveal its full symbol only after the linen was soaked and scrubbed. Fringe historians suggest that laundresses may have developed subtle chemical knowledge, basic chemistry by necessity, understanding how water, heat, and detergent-like soaps could transform, enhance, or erase markings. You probably won't survive appreciating this clever, almost experimental approach to textile management. Sometimes, marks were scorched into fabric using heated metal implements. You can almost feel the heat radiating from a small iron, the hiss as it touches the linen, and the faint smoky smell that lingers after a mark has been made. This method created permanent, tactile marks that couldn't be scrubbed away, perfect for important textiles. Historians still argue whether scorched marks were used mostly in noble households or if they were more widespread among merchants and guilds, but the evidence of experimentation is fascinating. Different fabrics demanded different methods. Coarse wool, fine linen, delicate silk, they each responded differently to ink, thread, and heat. You probably won't survive noticing how laundresses tailored their marking technique to the material, combining practicality with artistry. Fringe sources even suggest that some households developed secret methods for specific fabrics, blending dye, stitch, and scorch in unique ways to ensure identity, longevity, and recognition. You notice that certain motifs appeared more in particular methods. Threaded symbols were often reserved for prestige items or permanent claims, while painted or chalked marks were more ephemeral or experimental. You probably won't survive imagining the laundress juggling multiple methods, deciding each mark's medium with care, almost like a modern designer selecting fonts or textures. Historians still argue whether these choices were standardized or left to personal discretion, but the diversity suggests creativity and resourcefulness were highly valued. Sometimes, marks combined multiple techniques. A stitched initial might be supplemented by a painted swirl or a small scorch mark, layering permanence, visibility, and aesthetic appeal. You probably won't survive thinking about the planning required for such layered marks, each choice a deliberate act, each symbol a nuanced message. Fringe scholars suggest that these hybrid methods could signal more complex social information, or even humor, buried in the fabric. Finally, you notice the quiet artistry of these marks. Materials and methods were not just about survival or identification. They were expressions of skill, care, and individuality. A laundress who could craft an enduring, beautiful mark earned recognition, and her work reflected the sophistication of her household. You probably won't survive without admiring the centuries of innovation embedded in what modern eyes might dismiss as mere scribbles or scratches. Every line of ink, every stitch, every scorch tells a story of ingenuity, adaptation, and the silent dialogue between human hands and the fabrics they cherished. As you continue tracing the faded symbols, you notice a new layer of meaning. Religious and superstitious signs woven or drawn into the fabric. In the medieval imagination, linens weren't just practical, they were imbued with spiritual significance. You probably won't survive without imagining the faint cross stitched into a pillowcase or the tiny crescent moon on a handkerchief, each mark acting as a protective charm. Families believed these symbols could ward off illness, misfortune, or even bad weather, combining everyday practicality with the unseen world of spirits and divine influence. Crosses were among the most common motifs. A simple stitch could invoke protection for the household, its members, and the food or linens themselves. You picture a laundress pausing mid-stitch, whispering a quick prayer as she marks a napkin destined for the master's table. Fringe historians suggest that some symbols were drawn from local folklore, rather than strictly religious doctrine, blending the sacred with the mundane. Historians still argue whether the average household truly believed in the protective power of these marks or whether they were more ceremonial, serving as social and cultural markers. Other motifs were subtler. Crescent moons, stars, and even small representations of animals could serve dual purposes: decoration and magical defense. You probably won't survive noticing a tiny stitched rabbit in the hem of a towel, intended to protect the family from sickness while simultaneously acting as a playful visual flourish. Fringe sources even propose that some symbols were intended as charm-like codes, readable only to insiders familiar with both folklore and domestic practice. In a world where medicine was limited, and superstition intertwined with daily life, these marks were both comforting and functional. Some symbols functioned as household talismans, meant to protect specific areas or objects. You imagine a cross in a corner of a sheet protecting the sleeper, or a small spiral warding off thieves from a chest of folded linens. You probably won't survive without picturing the quiet power of these invisible guardians embedded in ordinary fabrics. Historians still argue whether such symbols were widely understood or highly localized, dependent on tradition and regional superstition. The placement of religious marks often mirrors the logic of protection in broader medieval culture. Prominent positions, edges, corners, or near openings, might be chosen for maximum symbolic efficacy. Less conspicuous placements could indicate subtle devotion or a private message. Fringe historians even suggest that some placements served dual functions, both shielding the item and signaling the spiritual literacy or piety of the household. You probably won't survive imagining the attention paid to each stitch, each carefully considered dot or swirl, combining aesthetics, protection, and social signaling. You notice that certain motifs recur in specific contexts. Small crosses or pentagonal shapes might appear on clothing, while moons and stars feature more often on bed linens. You probably won't survive realizing that laundresses were almost acting as spiritual scribes, embedding both functional and symbolic meaning in every fold. Historians still argue whether the choice of motif reflected personal belief, household custom, or broader regional superstitions, and the answer is likely a combination of all three. Some marks were even intentionally cryptic, mixing religious and secular symbolism. You can imagine a mark that looks like a simple flourish to outsiders but contains hidden motifs understood only by the household or guild. Fringe sources suggest these symbols could ward off both spiritual and human threats simultaneously, blending protective charm with ownership claim. You probably won't survive noticing how clever this dual functionality is. Medieval humans were masters of multi-layered communication, hiding messages in plain sight. Children learned these symbols as part of their domestic education. You picture a small apprentice tracing crosses or crescents under supervision, learning to replicate both form and function. Beyond mere decoration, these lessons taught observation, dexterity, and cultural literacy. Fringe historians suggest that children might also experiment with new symbols, testing household tolerance and creativity, sometimes resulting in playful deviations that carried unintended messages. Historians still argue how much freedom children had in altering symbols without disrupting household order. Interestingly, some religious marks were reused or adapted across generations. A motif stitched on a grandmother's bedspread could appear in a granddaughter's linens decades later, preserving continuity while subtly evolving in form. You probably won't survive noticing the sense of lineage embedded in these small symbols, the quiet transmission of culture through thread, ink, or scorch. Fringe sources propose that some families considered these inherited marks as minor talismans, carrying ancestral protection forward in time. Finally, there is a delightful interplay of superstition and humor. You might find a stitched charm meant to ward off illness but rendered in a tiny, amusing animal figure, a nod to human creativity even in spiritual matters. You probably won't survive appreciating the medieval sense of irony, protection, artistry, and levity coexisting in every careful mark. In these fabrics, the sacred and the whimsical blend seamlessly, offering a glimpse into the medieval worldview where the ordinary and the divine were intimately intertwined. You start noticing that laundry marks weren't just about ownership, guild affiliation, or spiritual protection. They were also instruments of social storytelling. Every stitch, doodle, or scorch mark could whisper gossip, subtle jabs, or household pride. You probably won't survive realizing that in a world without social media, linens became a quiet yet potent medium for commentary, a way to communicate without uttering a single word. A folded tablecloth or a hung sheet might carry tiny tales of rivalry, humor, or even scandal. Some marks functioned like medieval tweets. You imagine a laundress adding a tiny fox motif in the corner of a neighbor's linen, signaling slyness or cunning, while a swirl on a merchant's sheet could imply laziness or carelessness. French historians suggest that some symbols were deliberately ambiguous, leaving room for interpretation, so that a single mark could communicate multiple layers of meaning depending on who was observing. Historians still argue whether the intention was playful mischief or sharp critique, but clearly, the marks allowed households to participate in a subtle dialogue with the wider community. Pride and reputation were frequent themes. You probably won't survive picturing a well-to-do family marking linens to signal wealth, sophistication, or cleanliness standards, almost as if to say, observe how well we manage our household. In a world where physical appearance and reputation mattered greatly, marks became extensions of social identity. A small animal or geometric flourish could broadcast competence, taste, or the mastery of household management. Fringe sources even suggest that some families deliberately designed elaborate marks to impress visiting officials or neighbors, blending functionality with subtle performative flair. Sometimes, marks conveyed gentle mockery or rivalry. You notice a tiny hand-stitched star in a neighbor's sheet that, to insiders, hints at laziness or forgetfulness. You probably won't survive imagining the giggles exchanged among laundresses or household members who recognize the joke. Historians still argue whether these marks were a controlled form of social correction or simple amusement, but it's clear that humor played a surprisingly important role in domestic life. Household hierarchies were also reinforced through marks. Servants and children learned to read the symbols, knowing which linens were high status, which could be handled casually, and which were off-limits. You probably won't survive noticing how these subtle cues taught responsibility and reinforced social order, all without a single command being spoken. French historians suggest that this visual language functioned as both instruction and subtle social control, blending practicality with nuanced cultural education. Marketplaces amplified the storytelling aspect. Linen sent to fairs or sold in towns carried marks signaling quality, origin, and sometimes hidden messages about rival households. You imagine merchants exchanging glances over a piece of marked cloth, instantly grasping both its material value and the social cues embedded in its symbols. Fringe sources suggest that some marks acted as playful warnings, "Don't trust this seller," or "This cloth has been well cared for," creating a secret visual lexicon understood by those in the know. Historians still argue how widespread this literacy in marks truly was, though evidence points to a sophisticated, localized network. Even mundane shapes could carry nuanced meaning. A triangle might be simple protection, or it could denote alignment with a local guild or neighborhood faction. Circles, crosses, and zigzags often had layered interpretations depending on context, placement, and the observer's familiarity with the household. You probably won't survive thinking about how each mark functioned like a tiny storybook, waiting for those trained to read it to decode pride, criticism, or humor in a glance. Children and apprentices frequently contributed to this social narrative. You picture a young helper sneaking in an extra curl, or animal figure, either learning to participate in the household's visual language or mischievously altering the story told by the linens. French historians suggest that children's playful contributions occasionally sparked tension or amusement, depending on whether the household recognized the joke. Historians still argue whether these contributions were considered legitimate or merely tolerated as harmless fun, but they undeniably add vibrancy to the narrative woven into fabric. There was also a performative side. Some households arranged the display of marked linens to subtly impress or challenge neighbors. You probably won't survive imagining lines of laundry hung strategically, symbols oriented to be seen from the street, silently broadcasting household competence, pride, or even rivalry. Fringe sources suggest that subtle humor or hidden jabs could be intentionally included in these displays, making Laundry Day a miniature theater of social commentary. In short, social storytelling through laundry marks transformed a mundane chore into an intricate, visual conversation. Every mark could speak multiple messages, from pride and piety to jest and warning. You probably won't survive noticing the cleverness, humor, and subtlety woven into these everyday fabrics. It's a reminder that medieval humans, like you, thrived on communication, curiosity, and creativity, even in their laundry. These quiet messages, stitched and drawn across generations, offer a rare glimpse into how ordinary people engaged in the social theater of life, one marked hem at a time. You now begin to notice the human hands behind the marks, not just the marks themselves. Women, men, and even children participated in this silent, tactile language, and each group had its own rhythms, skills, and motivations. You probably won't survive realizing that understanding who made a mark can tell you as much as the symbol itself. Some marks are delicate and ornate, clearly the work of trained adult hands. Others are hasty or playful, suggesting a child experimenting or a servant adding a little flair to the daily grind. Women were the primary makers of these symbols. Laundresses, mothers, and daughters spent hours scrubbing, drying, folding, and marking fabric. You imagine their fingers raw from water and soap, eyes squinting in dim light, hands moving with practiced precision. Fringe historians suggest that some women innovated new symbols, passing them down to apprentices and children, creating regional or household-specific languages that lasted generations. Historians still argue whether women had autonomy in inventing these symbols or whether they strictly followed household or guild conventions. Men, though less frequently involved, also contributed, especially in merchant households or guild-affiliated families. You probably won't survive picturing a father or older brother sketching symbols on sheets before sending them to market, blending authority and practicality. Sometimes these marks reflected status, trade, or expertise in textiles, acting as visual signatures recognized by buyers and guild members alike. Fringe accounts suggest that some men's contributions were deliberately clever or cryptic, turning a simple mark into a puzzle for the initiated to decipher. Children learned the language of marks as part of their domestic education. You picture a small apprentice carefully tracing a cross, triangle, or animal motif under watchful supervision. Mistakes were part of the process, but each mark reinforced observation, dexterity, and social awareness. You probably won't survive realizing that a child learning to mark linens was simultaneously mastering literacy, numeracy, and social etiquette in one seemingly mundane chore. Historians still argue how much creative freedom children were allowed, but evidence shows that playful deviations were sometimes tolerated and even encouraged. Mischief was common. Children, apprentices, and sometimes adults inserted small jokes, secret messages, or decorative flourishes in unexpected corners. You imagine a tiny rabbit stitched into a pillowcase, a wink to someone in the household who would notice the humor. Fringe historians propose that some playful marks were intended as subtle critiques of authority, while others were simply artistic expression. You probably won't survive imagining how these tiny acts of rebellion and creativity breathed life into repetitive, physically demanding work. The division of labor influenced mark style. Women's marks often emphasized functionality and durability, threaded or inked with care for longevity. Men's marks, when present, sometimes favored bold or cryptic symbols, emphasizing identification over aesthetics. Children's contributions lean toward experimentation, sometimes accidentally inventing motifs that would later become standardized. You probably won't survive noticing how collaborative and intergenerational this quiet art form was, embedding social learning directly into fabric. Apprenticeships formalized some of this knowledge. In guild-affiliated households, older members taught younger ones to recognize symbols, replicate them accurately, and understand their social implications. You imagine a line of apprentices, hands poised over linens, eyes following an instructor's careful demonstration. Fringe sources suggest that in some cases, apprentices added tiny personal touches, which were gradually incorporated into household tradition. Historians still argue whether this was an intentional mentoring practice or an organic, trial-and-error learning process. Mistakes, intentional or not, could carry consequences. Misplacing a mark on a high-status sheet, omitting an essential flourish, or misunderstanding a symbol could create confusion or even mild social embarrassment. You probably won't survive picturing a laundress pausing mid-work, correcting a crooked stitch with exasperation, aware that the household's reputation rested on her skill. Fringe evidence suggests that over time, households developed redundancy in markings to prevent critical errors from undermining social order or property identification. Collaboration extended beyond the household. Some laundresses worked in communal washhouses, where women shared techniques, critiqued each other's work, and even borrowed playful motifs. You probably won't survive imagining the unspoken camaraderie, the exchange of tips and secrets, the subtle competition over whose marks were most clever or durable. Historians still argue how much these communal spaces contributed to standardization versus innovation, but clearly they were fertile ground for cultural exchange. Ultimately, the human element makes each mark a story, a conversation, a tiny artifact of personality and labor. You probably won't survive noticing how these marks represent more than utility. They encode memory, identity, skill, humor, and social nuance. Women, men, and children all participated in this intricate choreography, turning mundane laundry into a living network of communication and culture. In tracing their handiwork, you trace human life itself, messy, clever, collaborative, and endlessly inventive. You now imagine the journey of linens beyond the household, across bustling marketplaces, fairs, and dusty roads where merchants, travelers, and laundresses intersected. Traveling laundry carried marks that acted like passports, guiding textiles safely to their destination while signaling ownership, origin, or even subtle social cues. You probably won't survive picturing a sheet flapping in the wind above a busy town square, its tiny symbols silently broadcasting a family's reputation to anyone savvy enough to read them. Markets were a crucial hub for the circulation of marked linens. Merchants brought goods from towns and villages, displaying them on tables or hanging them on lines to catch the eye of buyers. You imagine the crowd leaning closer, noticing delicate symbols that indicated quality, origin, or even guild affiliation. Fringe historians suggest that these marks sometimes carried playful messages or hidden warnings. A subtle swirl might signal that the seller was trustworthy, while a small dot in the corner could indicate caution or subpar quality. Historians still argue whether most buyers fully understood the language of symbols or relied on intermediaries to decode it, but clearly some level of literacy in marks existed among regular market-goers. Traveling laundry also facilitated social networking. You probably won't survive imagining a laundress spotting a familiar motif in a distant town, instantly recognizing a fellow craftsman or ally. Symbols could denote connections between households, guilds, or entire trade networks, allowing textiles to move efficiently while maintaining a social context. Fringe sources propose that some marks doubled as private communications, relaying instructions about care, scheduling, or sales without exposing sensitive information to outsiders. The logistics were impressive. Linens might be bundled for fays, sent to markets, or carried across towns by apprentices and servants. Marks ensured that bundles didn't get mixed up, lost, or stolen. You probably won't survive picturing the careful folding and inspection, hands tracing familiar symbols as if following a visual map. Historians still argue how standardized these marking systems were for traveling textiles, but it's clear that families and guilds relied heavily on them for both practical and social purposes. Some marks acted as subtle advertisements. You imagine a merchant hanging a towel with a delicately embroidered fox motif, signaling the origin, quality, and skill of the craftspeople involved. Fringe historians suggest that clever placement and design could make a single mark perform multiple functions: ownership, protection, identification, and promotion. You probably won't survive noticing how much ingenuity was embedded in these small visual cues, blending artistry and commerce seamlessly. Traveling linens also carried playful or flirtatious undertones. Fringe accounts hint at the occasional mark serving as a wink or jest to someone far away, perhaps a tiny heart, a rabbit, or an exaggerated curl meant to amuse or intrigue the recipient. You imagine a servant delivering marked sheets to a distant relative and catching a knowing glance that interprets the symbol in a personal, humorous way. Historians still argue how intentional such signals were versus coincidental, but the evidence points to a culture rich in nuance and subtle communication. Even mundane items required careful marking. Bedding, tablecloths, and undergarments all traveled, and each needed clear identification. You probably won't survive imagining the care lavished on even coarse linens, the painstaking effort to ensure marks were legible, durable, and appropriately placed. Fringe sources suggest that families developed household-specific codes for traveling textiles, evolving them over time to prevent errors or miscommunication, creating a system as complex as any written ledger. Markets were also arenas of comparison and competition. A visitor could assess a household's reputation by the precision, style, and sophistication of its marks. You imagine one merchant scrutinizing a neighbor's textiles, noting tiny flourishes that suggested skill, care, and status. Historians still argue how much these symbols influenced actual trade outcomes, but it's likely they shaped perceptions and decisions, reinforcing both economic and social hierarchies. Traveling laundry highlights the adaptability of marks. They had to survive rough handling, sun exposure, and the scrutiny of strangers. Some symbols were deliberately bold for visibility, while others remained subtle for privacy. You probably won't survive imagining the careful calculation behind each mark: durability, legibility, and meaning, all balanced against aesthetic and social considerations. Fringe historians suggest that traveling linens may have driven innovation in marking techniques, pushing laundresses to perfect methods that could withstand extended journeys. Finally, the journey of laundry demonstrates how deeply embedded this secret language was in medieval life. You probably won't survive realizing that these marks were more than decoration. They were a sophisticated communication system, linking households, guilds, markets, and even distant communities. The linen, worn, washed, and carried across roads and towns, becomes a storyteller, a social map, and a testament to human ingenuity. Each mark is a breadcrumb leading you deeper into the quiet, clever world of medieval communication, where even the humblest fabric could carry a message. You notice that some symbols seem unusually intricate, as if the laundress or household member intended them to convey secret meaning beyond mere identification or ownership. These were the cryptic marks, a hidden layer of the medieval laundry language that only certain eyes could interpret. You probably won't survive imagining the tiny, almost imperceptible flourishes stitched along the hem of a sheet, each a code understood by insiders while remaining meaningless, or mysterious, to outsiders. These cryptic marks were often used for privacy or secrecy. French historians suggest that they might encode household rules, payment obligations, or even personal messages between family members. You imagine a laundress finishing a set of linens, slipping a subtle spiral in the corner to remind her employer of a forgotten favor or a minor debt, a private note stitched in plain sight. Historians still argue whether such messages were widespread or the exception, but surviving examples suggest a deliberate complexity beyond mere decoration. Some cryptic symbols were tied to personal identity. You probably won't survive realizing that one tiny emblem could denote an individual within a household, almost like a medieval username. Apprentices, servants, and family members all had variations of a common mark, allowing others to recognize the maker or owner at a glance. Fringe sources suggest that these identifiers were sometimes intentionally stylized to reflect personality traits, humor, cunning, diligence, all captured in a small cluster of thread or ink. The cryptic marks also served as protective measures. You can almost feel the tension as a laundress marks a valuable cloth with a nearly invisible symbol, ensuring that only those trained in the code could identify its significance. This was crucial in marketplaces or communal laundries, where outsiders might handle textiles. You probably won't survive picturing the quiet pride and cunning required to encode ownership and instructions in a way that remained useful but invisible to the uninitiated. Historians still argue whether cryptic marking systems were standardized or largely improvised. These marks sometimes reflected household politics. You notice a tiny animal stitched into a pillowcase, a wink to a favored child or servant, or a subtle signal to a family member about a household rule. Fringe sources suggest that playful deviations were occasionally used to gently challenge authority or highlight social tensions, creating a layer of interpersonal commentary hidden in fabric. You probably won't survive appreciating the creativity and subtle rebellion embedded in what looks like mundane laundry work. Apprentices and children played a crucial role in perpetuating these codes. You imagine a young helper carefully copying symbols under supervision, learning both the physical skill of marking and the social significance of each flourish. Fringe historians propose that some cryptic marks evolved organically as children experimented with variations, introducing playful innovations that were gradually accepted or refined. Historians still argue about how much influence children had on the evolution of these symbols, but their contribution seems undeniable. Some cryptic marks crossed households or even regions. You probably won't survive picturing a laundress spotting a familiar motif in a distant town and recognizing the maker, suggesting networks of shared symbols and knowledge. Fringe evidence hints at informal regional dialects of laundry marks, where slight variations carried the same meaning across communities. Historians still debate how extensive this knowledge was, but clearly, it facilitated communication, recognition, and trust between households and tradespeople. The sophistication of cryptic marks required attention to detail. Placement, spacing, and style all mattered, creating a subtle visual rhythm that could be read by insiders. You probably won't survive imagining hours spent perfecting a tiny emblem, balancing legibility, aesthetics, and secrecy. Fringe sources suggest that mistakes in execution could result in miscommunication or confusion, highlighting the precision and skill demanded by this hidden language. Cryptic marks also allowed households to encode instructions. For instance, a set of small lines or dots might indicate special washing requirements, folding techniques, or designated users. You probably won't survive realizing that this visual shorthand effectively served as a practical manual, embedded invisibly in everyday tasks. Historians still argue whether these codes were consistently taught or learned through observation and repetition, but both methods likely contributed to their spread. Finally, you notice that cryptic marks blend seamlessly with other types of marks. Ownership, guild affiliation, social storytelling, and protection all intersect, creating layers of meaning. You probably won't survive realizing that a single fold of fabric can carry multiple messages at once: practical, social, playful, and secretive. Each mark is a miniature narrative, a testament to human ingenuity, creativity, and subtle communication, hidden in plain sight yet waiting patiently for someone curious enough to read it. You start tracing the worn edges of a linen and notice how marks evolved over time, almost like a living language. Symbols weren't static. They adapted as families grew, households changed, and social context shifted. You probably won't survive imagining a sheet that began its life with a simple triangle, later enhanced with extra dots, lines, or tiny animals to reflect a new household member or a change in status. Each edition tells a story of continuity and change, of domestic life subtly recorded on fabric. Marks were not just updated randomly, they followed logic and tradition. You can picture a laundress carefully layering new symbols over old ones, respecting the original design while adding new meaning. Fringe historians suggest that these evolving symbols might reflect household events, such as marriages, births, or deaths, each layer carrying cultural and personal significance. Historians still argue whether these modifications were formalized or informal, but the patterns reveal careful attention to detail over time. Generational changes were evident, too. Children who learned to mark linens as apprentices eventually became the primary creators of symbols, gradually refining and modifying them to suit new needs. You probably won't survive imagining a granddaughter tracing a grandmother's old mark, then adding a small animal or flourish to modernize it, blending heritage with personal expression. Fringe sources suggest that some families maintained these traditions for decades, turning linens into living records of family history. Even functional marks evolved. A triangle or cross might start as a simple ownership indicator but gain extra lines, dots, or embellishments to indicate washing instructions, status, or even humor. You can almost feel the mental map a laundress carried, recalling each symbol's origin and meaning while deciding how to update it. Historians still argue whether functional evolution or aesthetic enhancement was the primary driver of change, but the evidence shows that both were influential. Marks also evolved regionally. You probably won't survive picturing a traveling merchant comparing textiles from multiple towns, noticing subtle differences in symbols that revealed geographic origins. Fringe historians propose that these regional dialects of marking allowed households and guilds to recognize outsiders, confirm authenticity, or subtly indicate affiliation. Over time, certain symbols became associated with particular cities, districts, or social networks. Social and political shifts influenced evolution as well. For example, changes in guild regulations, market demands, or household status might prompt alterations in marks. You can imagine a linen previously marked simply being updated to reflect a new alliance, a promotion in status, or a recent family merger. Fringe sources even suggest that some changes were used deliberately to confuse rivals or competitors, a subtle yet strategic layer of social maneuvering. Children and apprentices played a role in innovation, too. You probably won't survive picturing a young helper experimenting with flourishes or motifs, gradually adding personal touches to a mark that had persisted for decades. Sometimes these playful adaptations became accepted by the household, adding whimsy or local flavor to the symbols. Historians still argue whether such contributions were seen as rebellious or creative, but they undoubtedly influenced the evolution of household marks. Materials and techniques also adapted. New threads, dyes, inks, or scorching methods allowed for more detailed or enduring symbols. You can almost hear the laundress selecting from her toolbox of pigments and threads, considering how each choice would affect visibility, durability, and style over the long term. Fringe historians suggest that material availability could shape stylistic evolution, leading to regional or household-specific patterns that persisted through generations. Even the combination of symbols evolved. You probably won't survive noticing that triangles could be paired with stars, crescents, or animals to convey more nuanced information, creating complex, multi-layered messages that could adapt to changing household needs. These combinations were flexible, allowing households to communicate ownership, status, protection, humor, and instructions simultaneously. Finally, you notice that evolution was a form of storytelling. Every added flourish, line, or motif was a living record of household life, reflecting continuity, change, and the creativity of those who made and used the linens. You probably won't survive realizing that by tracing these evolving marks, you trace centuries of human thought, adaptation, and social interaction, tiny threads stitching together lives across generations, encoded in fabric that has survived, often unnoticed, for centuries. You now notice a fascinating interplay between secrecy and visibility. Marks were designed to be seen by some and invisible to others, a delicate balance that required subtle skill. You probably won't survive realizing that a single fold, crease, or placement decision could determine who understood the message and who didn't. Linen became a stage where privacy, trust, and social intelligence were constantly negotiated. Hidden marks were often tucked into hems, seams, or corners, nearly imperceptible unless you knew where to look. French historians suggest that some households maintained secret codes to protect valuables, convey instructions, or communicate family secrets, all embedded quietly in fabric. You imagine a laundress whispering instructions to an apprentice. Only you and I know this mark means it's for the master's table tonight. Historians still argue whether these codes were widespread or reserved for elite households, but surviving examples indicate a surprisingly sophisticated system. Conversely, some marks were meant to be visible, broadcasting status, skill, or ownership to outsiders. You probably won't survive picturing a tablecloth spread in the market, intricate motifs catching the eye, signaling both quality and identity. Fringe sources propose that such visibility could serve as advertisement, warning, or social commentary, merging practicality with subtle performance. The duality of secrecy and visibility allowed linens to function in multiple arenas simultaneously. In the household, symbols could communicate care instructions, hierarchy, or jokes. Outside, the same symbols could advertise skill, forge social connections, or signal loyalty. You probably won't survive noticing how clever this system is. A single mark could carry multiple, overlapping messages depending on the observer. Historians still argue how consciously households controlled this dual functionality versus how much emerged organically through practice. Some marks were deliberately ambiguous. You imagine a swirl or tiny animal that could mean one thing to a family member, another to a guild member, and something entirely different to a market inspector. Fringe accounts suggest that ambiguity provided flexibility, allowing symbols to evolve socially without losing functionality. You probably won't survive appreciating the subtle genius of this visual multivocality, a medieval form of semiotics stitched into every fold. Secrecy was also temporal. Certain marks might be relevant only for a particular day, festival, or season. You can almost feel a laundress timing her marking carefully, ensuring that a seasonal or temporary symbol communicates correctly for that brief window. French historians suggest this dynamic usage created a living language that adapted not just spatially across households and regions, but temporally within calendars and social cycles. Apprenticeship was essential for mastering this balance. You probably won't survive picturing a young helper learning to judge when a mark should be visible and when it should remain hidden, a skill combining dexterity, observation, and social intelligence. Historians still argue whether this knowledge was formally taught or primarily acquired through careful observation, but clearly, It required experience and insight. Symbols could also be playful in their secrecy. A tiny rabbit, dot, or swirl might hide a joke or affectionate note, visible only to the intended recipient. You probably won't survive imagining a laundress smirking quietly as she finishes a stack of linens, knowing that a private message now traveled silently across town, perhaps eliciting smiles long before words were exchanged. Fringe sources propose that humor was deliberately woven into these subtle codes, a quiet human touch in otherwise routine domestic labor. Even the most mundane items could carry layers of hidden meaning. You notice a coarse servant towel marked not just for identification but with a subtle flourish indicating care, instructions, or loyalty. You probably won't survive realizing that every stitch, curve, or scorch mark could operate on multiple levels simultaneously: practical, social, protective, and playful. Historians still argue how consciously households laid these messages, but the evidence shows an astonishing sophistication. Finally, the interplay of secrecy and visibility reminds you that these linens were more than objects. They were a network of communication, intelligence, and creativity. You probably won't survive noticing how every fold, mark, and stitch is a dialogue across time, a whisper, a joke, a warning, and a claim all at once. In the delicate art of concealment and display, medieval laundry reveals the cleverness, subtlety, and humanity of those who labored quietly yet thoughtfully in every home, marketplace, and guild hall. You begin noticing the tactile dimension of marks, the way symbols were felt as much as seen. Linen, silk, or wool held impressions, stitches, and scorches that created subtle textures under fingertips. You probably won't survive realizing that laundresses, apprentices, and family members could read linens by touch alone, discerning ownership, care, instructions, or hidden symbols without ever glancing at the surface. This sensory layer added depth to a language already intricate in meaning. Embossed or stitched marks offered resilience, especially in rough handling or repeated washing. You imagine a laundress running her fingers along a hem, feeling a raised pattern that tells her at a glance that the sheet belongs to the master's quarters or requires gentle care. Fringe historians suggest that tactile recognition may have been essential for visually impaired household members or in dimly lit medieval homes. Historians still argue whether tactile literacy was widespread, but surviving accounts indicate its practical importance. Texture also communicated subtle hierarchy. Rougher fabrics might carry simpler, functional marks, while fine linens were embroidered with intricate, raised designs. You probably won't survive picturing a line of folded sheets, your fingers tracing each mark as you mentally catalogue the household's social landscape. Fringe sources hint that children and apprentices often learn tactile literacy first, using touch as a foundational step before understanding visual symbolism. Heat and scorch techniques enhance tactile marks. You can almost feel the raised imprint of a heated iron pressed into linen, creating patterns both visible and tactile. These marks were especially durable, surviving harsh wash cycles and rough travel. You probably won't survive imagining the care needed to press a precise mark without scorching the surrounding fabric, a delicate dance between permanence and subtlety. Historians still argue whether scorch marks were mainly functional, decorative, or a combination, but evidence suggests multiple purposes were intentional. Tactile marks also allowed layers of meaning. You notice a faint ridge alongside a cross. The visual symbol communicates ownership, while the raised texture signals washing instructions. Fringe historians propose that multisensory coding made linens more resilient to misinterpretation, particularly when symbols might fade or be obscured. You probably won't survive picturing a laundress simultaneously decoding and reinforcing these cues, a practice combining artistry, practicality, and mnemonic strategy. Apprenticeship reinforced tactile literacy. You imagine a young learner practicing by feeling raised stitches, running fingers over patterns, and gradually memoizing which textures corresponded to which household or guild. Fringe sources suggest that tactile skill became part of social training, instilling patience, dexterity, and attention to detail. Historians still argue how widely this was applied beyond skilled households, but evidence shows it was significant where precise marking mattered. Play and humor persisted even in tactile marks. Tiny ridges or curls could carry inside jokes, subtle messages, or private commentary. You probably won't survive picturing a laundress pressing a small paw print into a sheet's corner, knowing only a few household members would recognize the gesture. Fringe accounts propose that these tactile flourishes were sometimes more appreciated than visual marks, adding layers of meaning and delight invisible to outsiders. Texture also facilitated verification in commerce. You can almost feel a merchant testing a linen bundle, fingers brushing over raised symbols to confirm authenticity, ownership, or quality. You probably won't survive noticing how this multisensory verification reduced fraud and reinforced trust between households and traders. Historians still argue how standardized these techniques were, but tactile literacy clearly had functional, social, and economic significance. Even mundane fabrics offered tactile cues. Coarse servants' towels might have a simple raised stitch, while high-status bedding could have multiple layers of texture, each corresponding to care instructions, ownership, or lineage. You probably won't survive imagining the mental map a laundress or apprentice carried, associating touch with meaning, skill, and responsibility. Fringe historians suggest that tactile marks were sometimes deliberately subtle, adding an element of hidden literacy accessible only to those trained to feel and interpret them. Finally, the tactile dimension reminds you that medieval laundry was a multisensory language. You probably won't survive realizing that linens were not only read visually but felt, interpreted, and communicated through touch, adding depth, precision, and intimacy to the everyday choreography of household life. Through fingers as much as eyes, medieval humans encoded knowledge, identity, humor, and care into fabrics that survived, telling stories across time, space, and generations. You now arrive at the culmination of the secret language, where all threads, marks, textures, and symbols converge into an intricate tapestry of meaning. This final layer isn't about a single household, a single laundress, or even a single guild. It's about networks of human connection, spanning generations, regions, and social strata. You probably won't survive realizing that a single marked sheet can trace journeys of care, ownership, humor, and secrecy, all while traveling through marketplaces, washhouses, and homes over decades. These interconnected networks reveal the sophistication of medieval communication. You imagine a single motif recognized in distant towns, linking households, families, and guilds in invisible lines of understanding. Fringe historians suggest that some marks functioned like a medieval social map, letting people navigate complex relationships, identify allies, or subtly warn against rivals. Historians still argue whether such widespread literacy in marks existed universally or was limited to specific communities, but the surviving evidence shows extraordinary ingenuity. Traveling linens were also historical carriers. You probably won't survive picturing a stack of sheets bearing multiple layers of marks, each representing a stage in its life. Who owned it, who washed it, where it traveled, what messages it carried, and which household traditions it reflected. Fringe sources suggest that textiles were sometimes treated as living archives, preserving household history in a form more durable than memory alone. Guilds played a key role in maintaining continuity and standardization. Certain symbols, flourishes, and motifs were shared across members, allowing recognition of skill, status, or compliance with guild norms. You imagine a master laundress comparing a newcomer's marks with established patterns, nodding in approval or instructing refinement. Historians still argue whether guild influence extended to informal or rural households, but there's little doubt that guilds enhanced consistency, visibility, and trust across regions. The social function of marks remained deeply human. They communicated pride, humor, affection, subtle critique, and protection. You probably won't survive imagining a laundress adding a playful curl to a symbol, knowing that only select eyes would recognize the joke, while the core function of the mark, ownership, protection, or instruction, remained intact. French historians propose that this layered approach to meaning mirrors broader medieval social practices, where public decorum often hid private humor, commentary, or strategy. Marks also evolved into quasi-art forms. Some households experimented with intricate combinations of stitch, scorch, ink, and texture to create marks that were both functional and visually captivating. You probably won't survive picturing a line of marked linens fluttering in the breeze, symbols telling stories of lineage, care, and creativity. Historians still argue whether the artistry was intentional or incidental, but the sheer diversity of surviving examples demonstrates considerable skill and imagination. Children and apprentices continued to contribute to this living language. You imagine a young helper adding subtle variations, sometimes playful, sometimes practical, which over decades became embedded in household tradition. Fringe sources suggest that these contributions were essential for the evolution of symbols, demonstrating that even seemingly mundane chores fostered creativity and learning. You probably won't survive noticing the quiet genius in this system: education, communication, and artistry all folded into daily life. Finally, all these threads, ownership, social storytelling, spiritual protection, cryptic codes, tactile literacy, and travel, intersect in a single moment of realization. You notice that every mark is a story, a preserved gesture, and a signal bridging time and space. You probably won't survive appreciating the profound subtlety, intelligence, and humanity embedded in medieval laundry. Each sheet, folded and marked, becomes a vessel of memory, care, and ingenuity, revealing a sophisticated, playful, and deeply social civilization that found meaning in the most ordinary of objects. Let your awareness soften, and imagine the gentle rustle of fabrics drying in the sun, each one carrying whispers of centuries past. You can feel the warmth of medieval courtyards, the scent of herbs and soaps mingling with linen, and the quiet rhythm of hands tracing symbols with care, pride, and occasional mischief. These marks, though long faded or hidden from plain sight, remain a testament to human creativity and subtle communication, reminding you that even the most mundane tasks can harbor depth, meaning, and beauty. You might imagine the passage of generations, children learning the language of symbols, apprentices perfecting their craft, and seasoned laundresses adding flourishes that convey humor, protection, or love. You probably won't survive without sensing the intimacy embedded in each stitch or mark, the care of a household, the silent conversation between maker and fabric, and the delicate choreography of meaning spread across daily life. Even as the world around them changed, markets bustling, guilds formalizing, households expanding, the quiet language of marks endured. You feel a connection to those who lived long ago, understanding that their cleverness, their whimsy, and their resourcefulness survive not only in fabric but in the very human impulse to communicate, protect, and delight. Let your imagination drift further now. Visualize a line of linens fluttering in a gentle breeze, each fold, stitch, and scorch telling stories, transmitting knowledge, and preserving memory. The world of marks, symbols, and textures fades gently into shadow as your mind follows the fabric into quiet corridors of history. Breathe slowly, feeling the richness of this hidden language, its subtle lessons, and its playful intelligence. You are alone with this intimate knowledge, and yet profoundly connected to countless hands that shaped it. Now, Dim the lights, and let your mind rest. The whispers of linens, the ingenuity of marks, and the silent stories of medieval life linger softly, wrapping you in the warmth and quiet magic of human ingenuity.